Hello all. So now let's discuss about Indian Councils Act 1919, that is also known as Minto-Morley Reform. Remember that Minto-Morley Reform (MMR). So see here, Minto-Morley Reform. British government. Lord Minto was Viceroy. Here Lord Minto was Viceroy. Lord Morley was Secretary of State. So Lord Morley, Secretary of State. Minto is Viceroy. Thus, this act is known as Minto-Morley Reform. So, what are the achievements of this act? Let's see. It increases the size of legislative council at the central and provincial level. So, it is the increased the size of legislative councils at the central and provincial level. Number of members, central legislative councils was increased from 16 to 60. So, members of the central legislative councils was increased from 16 to 60. The nominated members were allowed to ask the questions, supplementary questions, and was the resolutions on the budget. So they can ask questions also, supplementary questions also they can ask, and more resolutions on the budget. These by nominated members. They didn't allow right to vote. But one thing here you keep in mind, they don't have right to vote, but they can ask questions. They can raise the supplementary questions, and they can move the resolutions on the budget. So Satyendra Prasad Sinha became the first Indian to join the Viceroy Executive Council. So remember that Satyendra Prasad Sinha was the first Indian to join the Viceroy's Executive Council. He was appointed as a law member. And the act was allowed the separate elections which provides the Muslim members. So separate elections which provides the Muslim members were to be elected only by the Muslim voters. So it act was allowed the separate elections for Muslim members to be elected only by the Muslim voters. So see here, election term used here. Lord Minto was Viceroy. Lord Morley was Secretary of State. The number of members was Central Legislative Council was increased from 16 to 60. Elections were introduced in India for the first time. So elections were introduced for the first time under the Act of Indian Council Act 1909, Minto-Morley Reform. Separate elections for Muslims. Separate elections for Muslims only contested by the Muslim voters. So key point that you need to remember: separate elections for Muslims. Minto was Viceroy. Morley was Secretary of State. Election term is mentioned. The first time election was introduced, and central legislative councils were increased to 60 from the 16. Members were allowed for the supplementary questions, but not right to vote. They don't have right to vote, but they had supplementary questions. They can raise questions and they can move resolutions also. So Lord Minto is a viceroy here. The Morley is Secretary of State. You can see their images. So let's move to the next topic. The next topic is Government of India Act 1990. Government of India Act. Montagu was the Secretary of State. Montagu was the Secretary of State. Lord Chelmsford was the Viceroy of India. Chelmsford, Viceroy of India. Montagu was Secretary of State. Thus, this act is known as Montagu-Chelmsford Reform. Montagu-Chelmsford Reform. Remember that earlier one, Minto-Morley Reform. Here the Montagu-Chelmsford Reform. Government of India Act 1990. See the achievements from this act. The act separating the central and provincial subjects, which center control on the provinces. The system diarchy. The system diarchy, the dual role government introduced again. So dual government introduced again. The divided the provincial subject to the two parts. One is the transferred, second one is the reserved subject. Transport subject, reserved subject. The transport subject administered by the governor and with the aid of minister responsible to the legislative council. Remember that legislative council administered by the governor, that is transport subject. Reserved subject is administered by the governor with and is executive council without being responsible. So these people, executive councils, were not responsible for the reserved subjects. This is also legislative council. Provincial government were accountable to the legislative council of state. Provincial government were accountable to the legislative council of state and transfer subjects, but not reserved subject. Here, provincial governments were accountable to the legislative council of state, only state level, and the transfer subject, but reserved subject they are not responsible. So provinces had more freedom or autonomy to legislation to all the subject provisions that indicate state autonomy and a strong unitary system. Indian Legislative Council was replaced by bicameral legislative consisting of an upper house. So bicameral legislative consisting of an upper house council of states. Lower house is the legislative assembly. Lower house is the legislative assembly. Upper house is the council of state. Bicameral legislation. Now we are seeing Lok Sabha and Rajya Sabha. So likewise, they were upper house council of state and the legislative assembly is the lower house, bicameral method here. So which is majority members were chosen by the direct election. Separate election were to be continued for the Muslims. Separate elections to the Muslims, it was continued, and separate elections were extended to 6 Christians, Europeans, Anglo-Indians. 6 Christians, Europeans, Anglo-Indians, and Muslims. So these people were having the separate elections. So the required that the 3 of the 6 members of the Viceroy Executive Council, the commander-in-chief were to be Indian. The act granted the branches to the limited members to the people basis of property, tax, education. So election voting right based on the property, tax and education. Established Public Service Commission. They established Public Service Commission, which Central Public Service Commission, 1926. The Central Public Service Commission. Central Public Service Commission, 1926. It was set up. Important note. Just keep in mind for the exam purpose. Separate subject for the central and provincial states. Transport subject for the state, council and state level. Reserved subject for the executive level, that is central level. Reserved is central, transfer subjects for state legislature. Dual rule, diarchy introduced. Provinces had more freedom autonomy to legislative state subject and unitary system with the strong union and reserve subjects. Bicameral legislation are there, upper house, council of states, lower house, legislative assembly. Civil services were introduced. Central Public Service Commission established 1926. 1926. And separate elections for Muslims, Sikh, Christian, Anglo-Indian, European. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 5 communities, they were having the separate elections. Key points need to remember. Montagu-Chelmsford reform. It is called Montagu is a Secretary of State. Chelmsford is a Viceroy. Separate subject for the central and state. Bicameral. Bicameral upper house and lower house were introduced. Central Public Service Commission were introduced. Separate elections for Muslims, Christians, Anglo-Indians, Europeans, Sikh. So this is all about the Government of India Act 1990.